Chapter 11 The Great Collapse Part 1. And now the whole fabric of civilization was bending and giving, and dropping to pieces, and melting in the furnace of the war. The stages of the swift and universal collapse of the financial and scientific civilization with which the 20th century opened followed each other very swiftly. So swiftly that upon the foreshortened page of history they seem altogether to overlap. To begin with, one sees the world nearly at a maximum of wealth and prosperity. To its inhabitants, indeed, it seemed also at a maximum of security. When now in retrospect the thoughtful observer surveys the intellectual history of this time, when one reads its surviving fragments of literature, its scraps of political oratory, the few small voices that chance has selected out of 1,000 million utterances to speak to later days, the most striking thing of all this web of wisdom and error is surely that hallucination of security. To men living in our present world state, orderly, scientific, and secured, nothing seems so precarious, so giddily dangerous, as the fabric of the social order with which the men of the opening of the 20th century were content. To us it seems that every institution and relationship was the fruit of haphazard and tradition, and the manifest sport of chance. Their laws each made for some separate occasion, and having no relation to any future needs, their customs illogical, their education aimless and wasteful. Their method of economic exploitation indeed impresses a trained and informed mind as the most frantic and destructive scramble it is possible to conceive. Their credit and monetary system, resting on an unsubstantial tradition of the worthiness of gold, seems a thing almost fantastically unstable. And they lived in planless cities, for the most part dangerously congested. Their rails and roads and population were distributed over the earth in the wanton confusion 10,000 irrelevant considerations had made. Yet they thought confidently that this was a secure and permanent progressive system, and on the strength of some 300 years of change and irregular improvement, answered the doubter with, "Things always have gone well. We'll worry through." But when we contrast the state of man in the opening of the 20th century with the condition of any previous period in this history, then perhaps we may begin to understand something of that blind confidence. It was not so much a reasoned confidence as the inevitable consequence of sustained good fortune. By such standards as they possessed, things had gone amazingly well for them. It is scarcely an exaggeration to say that for the first time in history whole populations found themselves regularly supplied with more than enough to eat, and the vital statistics of the time witness to an amelioration of hygienic conditions rapid beyond all precedent, and to a vast development of intelligence and ability in all the arts that make life wholesome. The level and quality of the average education had risen tremendously, and at the dawn of the 20th century comparatively few people in Western Europe or America were unable to read or write. Never before had there been such reading masses. There was wide social security. A common man might travel safely over 3/4 of the habitable globe, could go round the earth at a cost of less than the annual earnings of a skilled artisan. Compared with the liberality and comfort of the ordinary life of the time, the order of the Roman Empire under the Antonines was local and limited. And every year, every month, came some new increment to human achievement. A new country opened up, new mines, new scientific discoveries, a new machine. For those 300 years, indeed, the movement of the world seemed wholly beneficial to mankind. Men said, indeed, that moral organization was not keeping pace with physical progress, but few attached any meaning to these phrases, the understanding of which lies at the basis of our present safety. Sustaining and constructive forces did indeed for a time more than balance the malign drift of chance and the natural ignorance, prejudice, blind passion, and wasteful self-seeking of mankind. The accidental balance on the side of progress was far slighter and infinitely more complex and delicate in its adjustments than the people of that time suspected. But that did not alter the fact that it was an effective balance. They did not realize that this age of relative good fortune was an age of immense but temporary opportunity for their kind. They complacently assumed a necessary progress towards which they had no moral responsibility. They did not realize that the security of progress was a thing still to be won or lost, and that the time to win it was a time that passed. They went about their affairs energetically enough, and yet with a curious idleness towards those threatening things. No one troubled over the real dangers of mankind. They saw their armies and navies grow larger and more portentous. Some of their ironclads at the last cost as much as the whole annual expenditure upon advanced education. They accumulated explosives and the machinery of destruction. They allowed their national traditions and jealousies to accumulate. They contemplated a steady enhancement of race hostility as the races drew closer without concern or understanding. And they permitted the growth in their midst of an evil-spirited press, mercenary and unscrupulous, incapable of good, and powerful for evil. Their state had practically no control over the press at all. Quite heedlessly, they allowed this torch paper to lie at the door of their war magazine for any spark to fire. The precedents of history were all one tale of the collapse of civilizations. The dangers of the time were manifest. One is incredulous now to believe they could not see. Could mankind have prevented this disaster of the war in the air? An idle question that, as idle as to ask, could mankind have prevented the decay that turned Assyria and Babylon to empty deserts, or the slow decline and fall, the gradual social disorganization, phase by phase, that closed the chapter of the Empire of the West? They could not, because they did not. They had not the will to arrest it. What mankind could achieve with a different will is a speculation as idle as it is magnificent. And this was no slow decadence that came to the Europeanized world. Those other civilizations rotted and crumbled down. The Europeanized civilization was, as it were, blown up. Within the space of 5 years, it was altogether disintegrated and destroyed. Up to the very eve of the war in the air, one sees a spacious spectacle of incessant advance. A worldwide security, enormous areas with highly organized industry and settled populations, gigantic cities spreading gigantically, the seas and oceans dotted with shipping, the land netted with rails and open ways. Then suddenly, the German air fleets sweep across the scene, and we are in the beginning of the end. The Great Collapse, Part 2. This story has already told of the swift rush upon New York of the first German air fleet, and of the wild, inevitable orgy of inconclusive destruction that ensued. Behind it, a second air fleet was already swelling at its gasometers when England and France and Spain and Italy showed their hands. None of these countries had prepared for aeronautic warfare on the magnificent scale of the Germans, but each guarded secrets, each in a measure was making ready, and a common dread of German vigour and that aggressive spirit Prince Karl Albert embodied, had long been drawing these powers together in a secret anticipation of some such attack. This rendered their prompt cooperation possible, and they certainly cooperated promptly. The second aerial power in Europe at this time was France. The British, nervous for their Asiatic empire and sensible of the immense moral effect of the airship upon half-educated populations, had placed their aeronautic parks in North India, and were able to play but a subordinate part in the European conflict. Still, even in England, they had 9 or 10 big navigables, 20 or 30 smaller ones, and a variety of experimental aeroplanes. Before the fleet of Prince Karl Albert had crossed England, while Bert was still surveying Manchester in bird's eye view, the diplomatic exchanges were going on that led to an attack upon Germany. A heterogeneous collection of navigable balloons of all sizes and types gathered over the Bernese Oberland, crushed and burnt the 25 Swiss airships that unexpectedly resisted this concentration in the Battle of the Alps, and then, leaving the Alpine glaciers and valleys strewn with strange wreckage, divided into 2 fleets and set itself to terrorize Berlin and destroy the Franconian Park, seeking to do this before the Second Air Fleet could be inflated. Both over Berlin and Franconia, the assailants, with their modern explosives, effected great damage before they were driven off. In Franconia, 12 fully distended and 5 partially filled and manned giants were able to make headway against, and at last, with the help of a squadron of Drachenflieger from Hamburg, defeat and pursue the attack and to relieve Berlin. And the Germans were straining every nerve to get an overwhelming fleet in the air, and were already raiding London and Paris when the advance fleets from the Asiatic air parks, the first intimation of a new factor in the conflict, were reported from Burma and Armenia. Already the whole financial fabric of the world was staggering when that occurred. With the destruction of the American fleet in the North Atlantic, and the smashing conflict that ended the naval existence of Germany in the North Sea, with the burning and wrecking of billions of pounds worth of property in the 4 cardinal cities of the world, the fact of the hopeless costliness of war came home for the first time, came like a blow in the face to the consciousness of mankind. Credit went down in a wild whirl of selling. Everywhere appeared a phenomenon that had already, in a mild degree, manifested itself in preceding periods of panic, a desire to secure and hoard gold before prices reached bottom. But now it spread like wildfire. It became universal. Above was visible conflict and destruction. Below, something was happening far more deadly and incurable to the flimsy fabric of finance and commercialism in which men had so blindly put their trust. As the airships fought above, the visible gold supply of the world vanished below. An epidemic of private cornering and universal distrust swept the world. In a few weeks, money, except for depreciated paper, vanished into vaults, into holes, into the walls of houses, into 10 million hiding places. Money vanished, and at its disappearance, trade and industry came to an end. The economic world staggered and fell dead. It was like the stroke of some disease. It was like the water vanishing out of the blood of a living creature. It was a sudden, universal coagulation of intercourse. And as the credit system, that had been the living fortress of the scientific civilization, reeled and fell upon the millions it had held together in economic relationship, as these people, perplexed and helpless, faced this marvel of credit utterly destroyed, the airships of Asia, countless and relentless, poured across the heavens, swooped eastward to America and westward to Europe. The page of history becomes a long crescendo of battle. The main body of the British Indian Air Fleet perished upon a pyre of blazing antagonists in Burma. The Germans were scattered in the Great Battle of the Carpathians. The vast peninsula of India burst into insurrection and civil war from end to end. And from Gobi to Morocco rose the standards of the jihad. For some weeks of warfare and destruction it seemed as though the Confederation of Eastern Asia must needs conquer the world. And then the jerry-built modern civilization of China, too, gave way under the strain. The teeming and peaceful population of China had been westernized during the opening years of the 20th century with the deepest resentment and reluctance. They had been dragooned and disciplined under Japanese and European influence into an acquiescence with sanitary methods, police controls, military service, and a wholesale process of exploitation against which their whole tradition rebelled. Under the stresses of the war, their endurance reached the breaking point. The whole of China rose in incoherent revolt, and the practical destruction of the central government at Peking by a handful of British and German airships that had escaped from the main battles rendered that revolt invincible. In Yokohama appeared barricades, the Black Flag, and the social revolution. With that the whole world became a welter of conflict, so that a universal social collapse followed, as it were a logical consequence upon worldwide war. Wherever there were great populations, great masses of people found themselves without work, without money, and unable to get food. Famine was in every working-class quarter in the world within 3 weeks of the beginning of the war. Within a month, there was not a city anywhere in which the ordinary law and social procedure had not been replaced by some form of emergency control, in which firearms and military executions were not being used to keep order and prevent violence. And still, in the poorer quarters and in the populous districts, and even here and there, already among those who had been wealthy, famine spread. The Great Collapse, Part 3. So what historians have come to call the phase of the emergency committees sprang from the opening phase and from the phase of social collapse. Then followed a period of vehement and passionate conflict against disintegration. Everywhere the struggle to keep order and to keep fighting went on, and at the same time the character of the war altered through the replacement of the huge gas-filled airships by flying machines as the instruments of war. So soon as the big fleet engagements were over, the Asiatics endeavoured to establish, in close proximity to the more vulnerable points of the countries against which they were acting, fortified centres from which the flying machine raids could be made. For a time they had everything their own way in this, and then, as this story has told, the lost secret of the Butteridge machine came to light, and the conflict became equalized and less conclusive than ever. For these small flying machines, ineffectual for any large expedition or conclusive attack, were horribly convenient for guerrilla warfare, rapidly and cheaply made, easily used, easily hidden. The design of them was hastily copied and printed in Pinkerville, and scattered broadcast over the United States. And copies were sent to Europe, and there reproduced. Every man, every town, every parish that could was exhorted to make and use them. In a little while, they were being constructed not only by governments and local authorities, but by robber bands, by insurgent committees, by every type of private person. The peculiar social destructiveness of the Butteridge machine lay in its complete simplicity. It was nearly as simple as a motor bicycle. The broad outlines of the earlier stages of the war disappeared under its influence. The spacious antagonism of nations and empires and races vanished in a seething mass of detailed conflict. The world passed at a stride from a unity and simplicity broader than that of the Roman Empire at its best, to a social fragmentation as complete as the robber baron period of the Middle Ages. But this time, for a long descent down gradual slopes of disintegration, comes a fall like a fall over a cliff. Everywhere were men and women perceiving this and struggling desperately to keep, as it were, to hold upon the edge of the cliff. A fourth phase follows. Through the struggle against chaos, in the wake of the famine, came now another old enemy of humanity, the pestilence, the purple death. But the war does not pause. The flags still fly. Fresh air fleets rise, new forms of airship, and beneath their swooping struggles the world darkens, scarcely heeded by history. It is not within the design of this book to tell that further story, to tell how the war in the air kept on through the sheer inability of any authorities to meet and agree and end it, until every organised government in the world was as shattered and broken as a heap of china beaten with a stick. With every week of those terrible years, history becomes more detailed and confused, more crowded and uncertain. Not without great and heroic resistance was civilization borne down. Out of the bitter social conflict below rose patriotic associations, brotherhoods of order, city mayors, princes, provisional committees, trying to establish an order below and to keep the sky above. The double effort destroyed them. And as the exhaustion of the mechanical resources of civilization clears the heavens of airships at last altogether, anarchy, famine, and pestilence are discovered triumphant below. The great nations and empires have become but names in the mouths of men. Everywhere there are ruins and unburied dead, and shrunken, yellow-faced survivors in a mortal apathy. Here there are robbers, here vigilance committees, and here guerrilla bands ruling patches of exhausted territory. Strange federations and brotherhoods form and dissolve, and religious fanaticisms begotten of despair gleam in famine-bright eyes. It is a universal dissolution. The fine order and welfare of the earth have crumpled like an exploded bladder. In 5 short years the world and the scope of human life have undergone a retrogressive change as great as that between the age of the Antonines and the Europe of the 9th century. The Great Collapse, Part 4. Across this sombre spectacle of disaster goes a minute and insignificant person, for whom perhaps the readers of this story have now some slight solicitude. Of him there remains to be told just one single and miraculous thing. Through a world darkened and lost, through a civilization in its death agony, our little Cockney errant went and found his Edna. He found his Edna. He got back across the Atlantic, partly by means of an order from the President, and partly through his own good luck. He contrived to get himself aboard a British brig in the timber trade that put out from Boston without cargo, chiefly, it would seem, because its captain had a vague idea of getting home to South Shields. Bert was able to ship himself upon her mainly because of the seaman-like appearance of his rubber boots. They had a long, eventful voyage. They were chased, or imagined themselves to be chased, for some hours by an Asiatic ironclad, which was presently engaged by a British cruiser. The two ships fought for 3 hours, circling and driving southward as they fought, until the twilight and the cloud drift of a rising gale swallowed them up. A few days later Bert's ship lost her rudder and mainmast in a gale. The crew ran out of food and subsisted on fish. They saw strange airships going eastward near the Azores, and landed to get provisions and repair the rudder at Tenerife. There they found the town destroyed, and 2 big liners with dead still aboard, sunken in the harbour. From there they got canned food and material for repairs, but their operations were greatly impeded by the hostility of a band of men amidst the ruins of the town, who sniped them and tried to drive them away. At Mogador they stayed and sent a boat ashore for water, and were nearly captured by an Arab ruse. Here too they got the Purple Death aboard, and sailed with it incubating in their blood. The cook sickened first, and then the mate, and presently everyone was down, and 3 in the forecastle were dead. It chanced to be calm weather, and they drifted helplessly and indeed careless of their fate backwards towards the equator. The captain doctored them all with rum. 9 died altogether, and of the 4 survivors, none understood navigation. When at last they took heart again and could handle a sail, they made a course by the stars, roughly northward, and were already short of food once more when they fell in with a petrol-driven ship from Rio to Cardiff, short-handed by reason of the Purple Death, and glad to take them aboard. So at last, after a year of wandering, Bert reached England. He landed in bright June weather, and found the Purple Death was there just beginning its ravages. The people were in a state of panic in Cardiff, and many had fled to the hills, and directly the steamer came to the harbour, she was boarded and her residue of food impounded by some unauthenticated provisional committee. Bert tramped through a country disorganised by pestilence, foodless, and shaken to the very base of its immemorial order. He came near death and starvation many times, and once he was drawn into scenes of violence that might have ended his career. But the Bert Smallways who tramped from Cardiff to London, vaguely going home, vaguely seeking something of his own that had no tangible form but Edna, was a very different person from the desert dervish who was swept out of England in Mr. Butteridge's balloon a year before. He was brown and lean and enduring, steady-eyed and pestilence-salted, and his mouth, which had once hung open, shut now like a steel trap. Across his brow ran a white scar that he had got in a fight on the brig. In Cardiff he had felt the need of new clothes and a weapon, and had, by means of that would have shocked him a year ago, secured a flannel shirt, a corduroy suit, and a revolver and 50 cartridges from an abandoned pawnbroker's. He also got some soap, and had his first real wash for 13 months in a stream outside the town. The vigilance bands that had at first shot plunderers very freely were now either entirely dispersed by the plague, or busy between the town and cemetery in a vain attempt to keep pace with it. He prowled on the outskirts of the town for 3 or 4 days, starving, and then went back to join the hospital corps for a week, and so fortified himself with a few square meals before he started eastward. The Welsh and English countryside at that time presented the strangest mingling of the assurance and wealth of the opening 20th century with a sort of Düreresque medievalism. All the gear, the houses and monorails, the farm hedges and power cables, the roads and pavements, the signposts and advertisements of the former order were still, for the most part, intact. Bankruptcy, social collapse, famine, and pestilence had done nothing to damage these, and it was only to the great capitals and ganglionic centres, as it were, of this state, that positive destruction had come. Anyone dropped suddenly into the country would have noticed very little difference. He would have remarked first, perhaps, that all the hedges needed clipping, that the roadside grass grew rank, that the road tracks were unusually rain-worn, and that the cottages by the wayside seemed in many cases shut up, that a telephone wire had dropped here, and that a cart stood abandoned by the wayside. But he would still find his hunger whetted by the bright assurance that Wilder's canned peaches were excellent, or that there was nothing so good for the breakfast table as Gobble's sausages. And then suddenly would come the Düreresque element, the skeleton of a horse, or some crumpled mass of rags in the ditch, with gaunt extended feet and a yellow, purple-blotched skin and face, or what had been a face, gaunt and glaring and devastated. Then here would be a field that had been ploughed and not sown, and here a field of corn carelessly trampled by beasts, and here a hoarding torn down across the road to make a fire. Then presently he would meet a man or a woman, yellow-faced, and probably negligently dressed and armed, prowling for food. These people would have the complexions and eyes and expressions of tramps or criminals, and often the clothing of prosperous middle-class or upper-class people. Many of these would be eager for news, and willing to give help and even scraps of queer meat, or crusts of grey and doughy bread in return for it. They would listen to Bert's story with avidity, and attempt to keep him with them for a day or so. The virtual cessation of postal distribution and the collapse of all newspaper enterprise had left an immense and aching gap in the mental life of this time. Men had suddenly lost sight of the ends of the earth, and had still to recover the rumour-spreading habits of the Middle Ages. In their eyes, in their bearing, in their talk, was the quality of lost and de-oriented souls. As Bert travelled from parish to parish, and from district to district, avoiding as far as possible those festering centres of violence and despair, the larger towns, he found the condition of affairs varying widely. In one parish he would find the large house burnt, the vicarage wrecked, evidently in violent conflict for some suspected and perhaps imaginary store of food, unburied dead everywhere, and the whole mechanism of the community at a standstill. In another he would find organising forces stoutly at work, newly painted notice boards warning off vagrants, the roads and still cultivated fields policed by armed men, the pestilence under control, even nursing going on, the store of food husbanded, the cattle and sheep well guarded, and a group of 2 or 3 justices, the village doctor or a farmer, dominating the whole place. A reversion, in fact, to the autonomous community of the 15th century. But at any time such a village would be liable to a raid of Asiatics or Africans or such like air pirates, demanding petrol and alcohol or provisions. The place of its order was an almost intolerable watchfulness and tension. Then the approach to the confused problems of some larger centre of population and the presence of a more intricate conflict would be marked by roughly smeared notices of quarantine, or strangers shot, or by a string of decaying plunderers dangling from the telephone poles at the roadside. About Oxford, big boards were put on the roofs, warning all air wanderers off with a single word: guns. Taking their risks amidst these things, cyclists still kept abroad, and once or twice, during Bert's long tramp, powerful motor cars containing masked and goggled figures went tearing past him. There were few police in evidence, but ever and again squads of gaunt and tattered soldier cyclists would come drifting along, and such encounters became more frequent as he got out of Wales into England. Amidst all this wreckage, they were still campaigning. He had had some idea of resorting to the workhouses for the night if hunger pressed him too closely, but some of these were closed, and others converted into temporary hospitals, and one he came up to at twilight near a village in Gloucestershire stood with all its doors and windows open, silent as the grave, and, as he found to his horror by stumbling along evil-smelling corridors, full of unburied dead. From Gloucestershire Bert went northward, to the British Aeronautic Park outside Birmingham, in the hope that he might be taken on and given food, for there the government, or at any rate the War Office, still existed as an energetic fact, concentrated amidst collapse and social disaster upon the effort to keep the British flag still flying in the air, and trying to brisk up mayor and magistrate in a new effort of organisation. They had brought together all the best of the surviving artisans from that region. They had provisioned the park for a siege, and they were urgently building a larger type of butterage machine. Bert could get no footing at this work. He was not sufficiently skilled, and he had drifted to Oxford when the great fight occurred in which these works were finally wrecked. He saw something, but not very much, of the battle from a place called Boar Hill. He saw the Asiatic squadron coming up across the hills to the southwest, and he saw one of their airships circling southward again, chased by 2 aeroplanes. The one that was ultimately overtaken, wrecked and burnt at Edge Hill. But he never learnt the issue of the combat as a whole. He crossed the Thames from Eton to Windsor and made his way round the south of London to Bun Hill. And there he found his brother Tom, looking like some dark, defensive animal in the old shop, just recovering from the Purple Death, and Jessica upstairs, delirious, and, as it seemed to him, dying grimly. She raved of sending out orders to customers, and scolded Tom perpetually lest he should be late with Mrs. Thompson's potatoes and Mrs. Hopkins' cauliflower, though all business had long since ceased, and Tom had developed a quite uncanny skill in the snaring of rats and sparrows, and the concealment of certain stores of cereals and biscuits from plundered grocers' shops. Tom received his brother with a sort of guarded warmth. "Law," he said, "it's Bert. I thought you'd be coming back some day, and I'm glad to see you, but I can't ask you to eat anything, because I haven't got anything to eat. Where you been, Bert, all this time?" Bert reassured his brother by a glimpse of a partly eaten Swede, and was still telling his story in fragments and parentheses when he discovered behind the counter a yellow and forgotten note addressed to himself. "What's this?" he said, and found it was a year-old note from Edna. "She came here," said Tom, like one who recalls a trivial thing, "asking for you and asking us to take her in. That was after the battle and setting Clapham Rise afire. I was for taking her in, but Jessica wouldn't have it, and so she borrowed 5 shillings of me quiet-like and went on. I dessay she's told you." She had, Bert found. She had gone on. She said in her note, to an aunt and uncle who had a brickfield near Horsham. And there at last, after another fortnight of adventurous journeying, Bert found her. The Great Collapse, Part 5. When Bert and Edna set eyes on one another, they stared and laughed foolishly, so changed they were, and so ragged and surprised. And then they both fell weeping. "Oh, Bertie boy," she cried, "you've come, and put out her arms and staggered. "I told him. He said he'd kill me if I didn't marry him." But Edna was not married, and when presently Bert could get talk from her, she explained the task before him. That little patch of lonely agricultural country had fallen under the power of a band of bullies led by a chief called Bill Gore, who had begun life as a butcher boy and developed into a prize fighter and a professional sport. They had been organized by a local nobleman of former eminence upon the turf, but after a time he had disappeared. No one quite knew how, and Bill had succeeded to the leadership of the countryside and had developed his teacher's methods with considerable vigour. There had been a strain of advanced philosophy about the local nobleman, and his mind ran to improving the race and producing the overman, which in practice took the form of himself especially and his little band in moderation marrying with some frequency. Bill followed up the idea with an enthusiasm that even trenched upon his popularity with his followers. One day he had happened upon Edna, tending her pigs, and had at once fallen a-wooing with great urgency among the troughs of slush. Edna had made a gallant resistance, but he was still vigorously about and extraordinarily impatient. He might, she said, come at any time, and she looked Bert in the eyes. They were back already in the barbaric stage when a man must fight for his love. And here one deplores the conflicts of truth with the chivalrous tradition. One would like to tell of Bert sallying forth to challenge his rival, of a ring formed and a spirited encounter, and Bert by some miracle of pluck and love and good fortune winning. But indeed, nothing of the sort occurred. Instead, he reloaded his revolver very carefully, and then sat in the best room of the cottage by the derelict brickfield, looking anxious and perplexed, and listening to talk about Bill and his ways, and thinking. Then suddenly Edna's aunt, with a thrill in her voice, announced the appearance of that individual. He was coming with two others of his gang through the garden gate. Bert got up, put the woman aside, and looked out. They presented remarkable figures. They wore a sort of uniform of red golfing jackets and white sweaters, football singlets, and stockings and boots, and each had let his fancy play about his headdress. Bill had a woman's hat full of cock's feathers, and all had wild, slouching cowboy brims. Bert sighed and stood up, deeply thoughtful, and Edna watched him, marvelling. The women stood quite still. He left the window and went out into the passage rather slowly, and with the careworn expression of a man who gives his mind to a complex and uncertain business. "Edna!" he called, and when she came he opened the front door. He asked very simply, and pointing to the foremost of the three, "That him? Sure?" And being told that it was, shot his rival instantly and very accurately through the chest. He then shot Bill's best man much less tidily in the head, and then shot at and winged the third man as he fled. The third gentleman yelped, and continued running with a comical end-on twist. Then Bert stood still meditating, with the pistol in his hand, and quite regardless of the women behind him. So far things had gone well. It became evident to him that if he did not go into politics at once, he would be hanged as an assassin, and accordingly, and without a word to the women, he went down to the village public house he had passed an hour before on his way to Edna, entered it from the rear, and confronted the little band of ambiguous roughs who were drinking in the tap room and discussing matrimony and Bill's affection in a facetious but envious manner, with a casually held but carefully loaded revolver, and an invitation to join what he called, I regret to say, a vigilance committee under his direction. "It's wanted about here, and some of us are getting it up." He presented himself as one having friends outside, though indeed he had no friends at all in the world but Edna and her aunt and 2 female cousins. There was a quick but entirely respectful discussion of the situation. They thought him a lunatic who had tramped into this neighbourhood ignorant of Bill. They desired to temporize until their leader came. Bill would settle him. Someone spoke of Bill. "Bill's dead. I just shot him," said Bert. "We don't need reckon with him. He's shot. And a red-haired chap with a squint. He's shot. We've settled up all that. There ain't gonna be no more Bill ever. He'd got wrong ideas about marriage and things. It's his sort of chap we're after." That carried the meeting. Bill was perfunctorily buried, and Bert's vigilance committee, for so it continued to be called, resigned in his stead. That is the end of this story so far as Bert Smallways is concerned. We leave him with his Edna to become squatters among the clay and oak thickets of the Weald, far away from the stream of events. From that time forth, life became a succession of peasant encounters, an affair of pigs and hens and small needs and little economies and children, until Clapham and Bun Hill and all the life of the scientific age became to Bert no more than the fading memory of a dream. He never knew how the war in the air went on, nor whether it still went on. There were rumours of airships going and coming, and of happenings Londonward. Once or twice their shadows fell on him as he worked, but whence they came or whither they went he could not tell. Even his desire to tell died out for want of food. At times came robbers and thieves, at times came diseases among the beasts and shortness of food. Once the country was worried by a pack of boarhounds he helped to kill. He went through many inconsecutive, irrelevant adventures. He survived them all. Accident and death came near them both ever and again, and passed them by, and they loved and suffered, and were happy. And she bore him many children, 11 children, one after the other, of whom only 4 succumbed to the necessary hardships of their simple life. They lived and did well, as well was understood in those days. They went the way of all flesh, year by year.